It's time for the polling station. It's Johnny Ward, and I'm sitting here in front of the river in County Wicklow on a beautiful day, contemplating life. And one thing I didn't think I'd be talking about was the internal market bill, which I have to say, William Kedjanyi, I was basically completely in the dark as to what this meant until you told me what it meant, or at least you're going to tell me now. And why are we talking about the internal market bill? And how are you?
I'm very well. Good to be back. Good to be talking about Brexit, I guess, although many people watching might disagree. The internal markets bill isn't necessarily the easiest thing to explain, and I definitely point you in the direction of experts like the Institute for Government. But it's basically caused a lot of controversy because there is a clause within the bill which would override parts of the withdrawal agreement and, as the government has admitted, break international law. Now, there's a lot of noise about that. The signal here is basically twofold. Number one, the government still thinks it can play hardball even at this late stage, and it's doing so with a reasonable amount of support from its key backers, not overwhelming, but reasonable enough for it to continue on. And also, I think there's still a position, and they're thinking very much in Westminster, that the EU can be forced into some concessions, or even that actually, we're not getting what we want out of this deal, we'll walk away.
I don't know if you saw Andrew Marr and Simon Coveney, who'd be one of the heavy hitters in Ireland. It's just from an Irish perspective, it's striking, and the lack of respect for Boris Johnson now seems to run very deep. But we are where we are, I guess.
Yeah, the government isn't really much concerned with optics. They've already made their enemies, and they are still very much operating, even with this 80-strong majority, in a siege mentality. Now, what this means to punters is actually quite interesting, because we had markets on the second reading last night, which is basically, in pure and simple terms, a vote.
Right.
And the number of rebellions actually came in very low. You could have got 5-1. That there were 3 or less rebels on the second reading. That came in. With abstentions, our lines are pretty much spot on. We had 25-31 abstentions as an 11-4 shot. The next key stage in this for punters who might be looking for some value, either on whether they're having about a Brexit trade deal or whether they want to get ahead of the polls moving, is next Tuesday with the Bob Neal amendment. My advice would be, if you're trying to forecast a move at the polls, just remember that Brexit is probably the key thing holding the Tory vote together. They haven't dipped below 40% in 10 months. It's difficult to see this exactly doing that.
Yeah, something as shambolic in my mind as Brexit is actually holding the Tory vote together. We live in strange times. And speaking of which, the Trump-Biden race, we've spoken about this week in, week out. The betting has been steady over the past 7 days, still 3-4, 11-10. Biden is favourite. But you sent me an interesting article there about the relevance of the economy in the minds of Americans as the election nears. And obviously the coronavirus has been going on for so long. What intrigues me is I don't necessarily see why Trump should be relied upon for the economy, but will this play in terms of people's vote?
It definitely will. The economy is the key argument.
It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah, it is. And plenty of presidents have won it that way before. I think it really sealed Bill Clinton's run for presidency. I think very much it played a big part in Barack Obama being elected the first time around, especially after the financial and economic crash. I think it played a part in 2016 with Trump first time around. And I think if Trump is going to cut the 7-point gap in the polling averages, he needs some sort of economic rebound. I think law and order is something he'll focus a lot on, but I'm not sure if the ground there is as fertile.
Law and order is a complete fallacy.
Yeah, it is, but it's also a very good optical play because it gets people scared about the idea of President Biden. And the whole point with Biden...
Absolute nonsense, William. And people still buy this nonsense.
They do. We've seen it in lots of campaigns in recent times. You might even argue over here, I'm sure some people watching would think so. What the Trump campaign is trying to do is essentially get people not less excited, but more fearful about a President Biden.
Fear is a strong thing.
It is, really is a strong thing. And as you've seen, it can work in the past. And one thing that they're hoping to do is to try and convince around the 30% of voters who are unsure that Biden isn't basically controlled by the left wing of the Democratic Party, that he isn't really, a wolf in sheep's clothing or a puppet for socialists or whatever.
Head under the bed.
Yeah, red under the bed. And this McCarthyism can work. It definitely works, but to an extent. But Trump needs it to be with suburban women, and I think also sort of floating voters who are considering voting Democrat. I don't know how well that will work now compared to 4 years ago. We have to wait and see.
So in the land of the free, anything that's even vaguely left-wing, you're essentially a commie.
That's a pretty broad way of putting it, but actually it's pretty close to the truth. The political spectrum over there is wildly different compared to what you have in Europe, and that factors a lot into their elections, and also it factors quite a lot into market moves as well. I'm going back a bit in history here, but we always saw this with how reluctant I think punters were when Bernie Sanders was the front runner to really get behind him. There was a point at which Sanders was still leading the popular vote and Warren was close behind, Biden was in fourth, and people were punting by Bloomberg. So punters are definitely really aware of the American spectrum, and it will play a big part in November, although that said again, there are loads of facts I think people might be forgetting when they look solely at polls and forecasts. For all, I really do trust that data.
I don't really want to hear from you anymore because you're just giving me this potential that Trump could win despite everything suggesting that he won't. It cannot happen, William. It will not happen. Talk to me about independence.
Yeah, so support for Scottish independence has been steadily growing. Compared with a year or so ago, support for Yes leaving the UK has grown about 5.3 points. And I think we're only heading into an era now where the argument now, it's much harder to deny. After the first referendum, it seemed relatively safe and a done deal. You stay in the UK, you stay in the EU, you get all the economic benefits, you get stability, rather than having to negotiate a messy exit with arguments over borders and trade. And then the UK, spurred on by England and Wales, voted to leave the EU, and we're going for a messy divorce, a messy trade deal. And now there's going to be a special clause for Northern Ireland, which needs to happen, in my opinion. But people aren't happy about that. So you've got Indy Ref 2 to take place for 2025 at a 10 to 11 shot. And you've got 4 to 7 if that takes place, that Yes wins. I think those are fair prices. I think if you had it tomorrow, there wouldn't be much doubt for me. Over a campaign, things can change, but defending the union is a much harder task now. It's a much harder task. You cannot just point to Westminster and say Scotland is getting the best deal with all the conviction needed to, I think, switch floating voters. And I think people will have a lot more doubts about the union next time around.
It's going to have massive ramifications for Ireland as well, in the sense of the border here, I would argue, and compelling times ahead. On that issue, I completely agree with you. I think Scotland is probably heading that way, but we don't know. We shall talk more probably next week. As ever, you've been brilliant, William, and thank you for listening to the polling station and watching. And hopefully, we see you next week.